One of our recent speakers here at WorldDenver told us that U.S. nuclear weapons arsenals may have fallen into sort of dangerous conditions. They're deteriorating. We're not spending the money that it would take to keep them safe. And so I guess I'd love to hear your view on that. Are weapons becoming dangerous to us?
The U.S. government puts a lot of money into making sure that American nuclear weapons only detonate at an explicit order that has to be generated by the president. And so I think there are a lot of safety mechanisms, but they require a lot of care. They're complex pieces of equipment. There has been some attention, and your speaker may have been referring to this, to the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force, the ICBMs in Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming. And some of the stories that came out, I think CBS did.
And northern Colorado.
Right, northern Colorado, that's from the Francis E. Warren era. That, in fact, some of the systems they use are very old. In fact, they're still using floppy disks. Now, actually, somebody once pointed out that in a way this has a positive thing, is it's nearly impossible for anybody to try to hack into those systems because they're simply not compatible. But I think the Air Force is taking note, and they're trying to update those systems. So I think that we have systems that are relatively secure. I would still like to see reductions in those systems in the numbers. But a lot of that depends on the Russians, and so far the Russians, after the treaty that was signed in 2010, the Russians don't seem to be interested in further reductions at this time.
So do you think all of this activity in Eastern Europe is really getting in the way of progress in arms control?
Certainly the deterioration in relations between the United States and Russia has made the environment more difficult for arms control. But even if you go back 1 or 2 years, arms control wasn't moving in the direction I would have liked to have seen. So in 2010, President Obama and then Russian President Medvedev signed the new Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty. And that requires that by 2018, each country comes down to no more than 1,550 deployed strategic warheads. And that compares to 10,000 nuclear warheads that the sides had at the end of the 1980s, on no more than 700 deployed missiles and bombers. And that process is going forward. But when the treaty came into force in 2011, almost immediately the Obama administration said, we'd like to do more. And they said, not only reduce those numbers, but also go on and let's bring in reserve strategic warheads, which aren't counted by the treaty. If you take a warhead off an intercontinental ballistic missile and put it in storage, it disappears for purposes of the treaty. And then let's also bring in non-strategic weapons. So the idea the first time that you might have a negotiation between Washington and Moscow that covered all their nuclear weapons. They pushed that idea fairly hard in 2011. There really was no interest on the part of the Russians. And what we've seen in the last couple of years, even before the crisis between Ukraine and Russia, has been the Russians saying, well, there are all of these issues. There's missile defense questions that have to be resolved, third country nuclear forces. The Russians, for example, now say that the next negotiation should not be just the United States and Russia. It should bring in Britain, France, and China. And I agree with the Russians in principle. If you're reducing nuclear weapons, at some point you need to bring in Britain, France, and China. But I'm not sure you have to do it now. If you look at total nuclear arsenals, the United States and Russia, under unclassified estimates, reach at about 4,500 total nuclear weapons. The nearest third country is France at 300. So I'd argue there's significant room for the United States and Russia to come down. And at some point you have to bring in Britain, France, and China, and then the others, but we're not there yet. But the Russians seem to have made that a condition, and my guess is the Russians are making those conditions because they're not prepared for further reductions.
To slow things down.
Yeah, and it may get back to, I think, Vladimir Putin's image of Moscow is a country as a superpower. But when you look at Russia in real terms economically, I mean, its economy, it's been growing, but it's still, on par with maybe Brazil. Nuclear weapons are the one area where Russia can truly claim superpower status. So my fear is that for Putin, nuclear weapons are not just about defense, but it's about the image of Russia as a great power. And that may be the big factor that's basically frozen our ability to bring the numbers down.
So this is Russian nationalism sort of taking precedence over arms control.
I think that there's a certain degree of that. And for the Russians, I mean, and part of it was understandable. I mean, in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian economy went into free fall. And the Russian military really did not get much funding and was a shadow of its former self by the end of the 1990s. And so I think the Russians came to rely more on nuclear weapons. They're now increasing the funding. They're building up their conventional capabilities. And maybe at some point one hopes that they'll come to the conclusion that I think the Obama administration came to, is that nuclear weapons, they can serve a purpose in terms of deterring a nuclear attack on the United States or its allies, but that they can't do much else. And certainly if you look at what NATO has done in the last 4 months in response to concerns about Russia, none of it's been nuclear. It's all been with conventional forces.
Vietnam wants to buy weapons from the United States. Heard that this morning. And it just reminded me that weapons making is such a big industry in our country, and selling them around the world is, to some people a questionable practice, whether we should be arming the world. And so I wonder how big a piece this is of foreign policy. How do we think about that, and how do you think about it at the Brookings Institution? And secondly, how often do we see these weapons turned against us?
Certainly, the United States is, by most accounts, the largest exporter of weapons. I think the U.S. government tries to do it in a responsible way. And certainly, a lot of times, these arms relationships are seen as a way of maintaining influence. For example, with Saudi Arabia, if we sell the Saudis F-15 aircraft, that gives us a linkage. Does that give us some impact both politically and also with the Saudi military? So there are also, I think, certain goals there beyond just the profit that an American arms maker may reach. It fits into a broader political strategy. But we do have to be careful where we send these weapons, and we do have to look very carefully at the countries, how they're going to use those weapons. I mean, certainly there are some purposes that countries might put American weapons to that we would not want to see. Or can they take care of them? I mean, I think it was an unpleasant surprise to many in the U.S. military when you saw the ISIS advance into Iraq several months ago, and they're driving American Humvees that had been provided to the Iraqi army. So there has to be, I think, some judgment when you provide weapons. Can the military that receives those weapons, can they care for them? Are they going to use them in a way that we regard as proper, including for truly defensive needs, not for aggressive purposes and not against their own populations? And can they also keep those weapon systems under their own care so they don't get out to non-governmental groups, and in some cases get out to the bad guys?
But how do we really monitor that?
Where we have big defense sales, usually the embassy will have a defense attache's office. And one of the things that those offices tend to monitor, what is the host country doing? If we've sold them F-16s, what are they doing with those F-16s? Are they operating them in certain ways? Are there concerns that we might have about what they're doing with American weapon systems? So I think there is an effort after the sale is made to watch the country, because certainly it's a huge international political embarrassment for the United States if somebody takes American weapons and uses them in the wrong way.
Thank you very much for being with us today, Ambassador Pifer from the Brookings Institution. And I know your wife is a native Coloradan. I hope you're enjoying these few lovely days at the end of fall.
We're delighted to be back here, and thank you very much for having me today.